Hey there, and welcome back to MTG Another Look. And if you're new here, welcome and thank you for clicking. MTG Another Look is a channel where we talk about underutilized or otherwise interesting cards for Commander. We also discuss previews, reprints, and sometimes do pack openings, just for a little treat. If you end up enjoying the video, give it a like and subscribe to really help out the channel. Thanks a lot, everyone. Now let's take another look and get into it. Let's talk about Spellbinder. For 3 mana, it's an equipment artifact with an equip cost of 4. When it enters the battlefield, you can exile an instant from your hand and imprint it on this. And whenever a equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, you may copy the exiled card. If you do, you may cast the copy without paying its mana cost. So this is a very cool card, and I think it's gone under the radar for most of its existence. It lets you cast instants over and over every time you hit a player with the creature it's equipped to. That's pretty interesting. We don't see too many cards like that. Immediately, you may think of Isochron Scepter because it does a similar thing. It imprints a cheap instant onto it and can be cast repeatedly if you activate it. Isochron Scepter has been a very powerful card that was used consistently in Eternal formats like Old Extended, Legacy, and Vintage. What people would do is they would imprint Orym's Chant on Isochron Scepter and activate it on each of their opponent's turns to prevent them from playing any non-instant speed spells, and lock them down so that they can't attack. When you have your opponent locked out of playing relevant spells or hitting you, you can take your sweet time finding and deploying your win condition. Panoptic Mirror is another card with this kind of effect. You can pay the mana to imprint an instant or sorcery onto the mirror, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you get to cast a spell for free. Panoptic Mirror is banned in Commander. I think the idea was that it would be too easy to imprint an extra turn spell like Time Warp onto the mirror and take infinite turns. Is that overpowered for what happens regularly in Commander? Not even close. Is it kind of lame to do to other people? Yeah, a little bit. I actually kind of miss Panoptic Mirror and think it would be a lot of fun to be able to play with it in Commander. But I agree that the infinite turns loop shouldn't happen regularly. I believe the actual problem is extra turn spells, and Panoptic Mirror died for the sins of extra turn spells. If anything, I think they're worse for the format than the mirror, but I digress. My point of bringing these up is that Isochron Scepter and Panoptic Mirror have a history of either competitive play or being able to do some rough things that the Rules Committee felt warranted a ban. And Spellbinder is another legal card that does something similar. It's worth taking a look at. It's important to note that you can pay additional costs of the cards imprinted on the scepter, meaning that you could pay 2 mana to get the original Orym's Chant and pay an extra white to kick the spell and get the extra effect. The same is true with Spellbinder. When you deal combat damage to a player, you get the spell cast for free, and at that time you can pay any additional costs to get those effects. That means you can pay Kicker, Entwine, or Replicate costs, for example. Now you may be thinking, that's perfect. I know a 2-mana instant that I'd love to cheat extra effects onto every turn. Cyclonic Rift is a perfect fit. But unfortunately, that won't work the way you hope it does. The overload cost on Cyclonic Rift and other cards with the mechanic use an alternative cost, not an additional cost. I know this all sounds a bit wonky and can be confusing for new players, but it's important to know the difference. It says you may cast the Cyc Rift for its overload cost, and if you do, you get the extra effect. If it's imprinted on an Isochron Scepter or a Spellbinder, they will allow you to cast the base effect and just return 1 non-land permanent to an opponent's hand. The Cyc Rift is exiled, and you cannot pay an alternative casting cost of a card that's in exile this way. And the imprint artifacts just say that you can cast a copy of the spell, not play it for its alternative cost. A new card called Sword of Wealth and Power was just released in Outlaws of Thunder Junction. It's a sword that can copy instants and sorceries when the equipped creature hits an opponent. It's a strong new card that wants you to play creatures, equipment, and have spells that you would like to copy. Sound familiar? It seems to me that it functions in a very similar way to Spellbinder and fits in the same types of decks that would want to play it. I think Spellbinder, Sword of Wealth and Power, and Isochron Scepter would all go perfectly together in a deck. One of the previous problems of having a card like Isochron Scepter in a Commander deck is that you have to build around it a bit to have instants that will meet the 2 mana value or less requirement, and you're never guaranteed to draw the Scepter without dedicating more deck slots to tutoring it out of your deck. But with these 3 cards, we now have access to a kind of redundancy that we never have before. And what's gotten me so excited is the release of the new Spree mechanic. It's a mechanic with additional costs you can pay when you cast a spell. Let's look at Final Showdown, 3 Steps Ahead, and Great Train Heist. These cards cost 1 mana and are instants. They all fit on a Spellbinder because they're instants, and they fit on a Scepter because they cost 2 or less. With the imprint artifacts, you can play them potentially every turn, and pay any number of the additional costs to choose which effects you want. This sounds great to me. Final Showdown is a wrath effect you can cast every turn. That seems like a big deal. 3 Steps Ahead is a counterspell you can put on a Scepter, which isn't new, but it can also make token copies of creatures and, more importantly, artifacts. So if you put a copy of 3 Steps Ahead on your Spellbinder, you can pay the extra 3 mana to copy your Spellbinder or Scepter, and imprint other cards on those for access to more repeatable spells. That sounds awesome. Great Train Heist is another extra combat spell that goes well on a Spellbinder. For 3 mana, every time you hit an opponent, you can get an extra combat step and attack again, to hopefully trigger the Spellbinder again and do it repeatedly as many times as you can pay 3 mana. You could even put a Bear Umbra or something similar on your creature to make sure you get infinite combat steps. There are a lot of cool things you can do with these free cards. And with Spellbinder, the only requirement for the imprinted card is that it be an instant. So you can do that dirty thing we talked about earlier with a Panoptic Mirror. If you imprint a Nexus of Fate on your Spellbinder, you can get infinite turns as long as you keep connecting with opponents. Yuck. Or you could just put a Magma Opus on it and get ridiculous amounts of value every time you connect. Think of the biggest, dumbest instant spells you can, and you get to cast them for free with the Spellbinder. You can put a Teferi's Protection on it and hit an opponent every turn, and then peace out and be untouchable every turn for the entire game. Even putting a simple Frantic Search on it early can help you with card selection, but also ramp you 3 mana every time you connect. There's a lot of utility here, and the only requirement is that you play instants in the deck. Give this card a try, I think it'll be a lot of fun. It can go great in any Sunforger decks like Kellen the Fayblooded. Sunforger wants you to play instants it can search out, and you'll have plenty of equipment synergies to cheat the cast or equip costs on your Spellbinder. It can go great in a Tetsuo Imperial Champion deck. It's another deck that cares about equipment and spells. You can play it to great effect in really any kind of Spellslinger deck too. For example, putting it on a Calamax the Stormsire can help you cast and copy huge instants that you already would be playing, and can cheat the mana cost. Speaking of repeatedly casting the same spells, the next card can kinda let you do that too, but in a different way. Next up is Conduit of Worlds. It's a green artifact. It costs 2 and 2 green. It says, you may play lands from your graveyard. And it also has a tap ability. Tap, choose target non-land permanent card in your graveyard. If you haven't cast a spell this turn, you may cast that card. If you do, you can't cast additional spells this turn. Activate only as a sorcery. For 1 more mana, you get the classic Crucible of Worlds text. Crucible of Worlds is also a card that's seen a lot of competitive play. It can be used alongside fetch lands for card advantage. It was played in lands decks and things like Legacy to create potent locks on your opponents by playing Glacial Chasm every turn to prevent your opponent's most common avenues of winning. You could loop something as small as Barbarian Ring to be your slow but inevitable win condition. Conduit of Worlds has all the same synergies in Commander that Crucible of Worlds has. You can still loop a Glacial Chasm every turn to make your opponents miserable, and yourself almost impossible to touch. But I think it has more value as a value piece. You should play it alongside fetch lands and maybe alongside cards that allow you to play extra lands per turn like Exploration, so when used in tandem, the 2 cards can help you ramp every turn, whether you have lands in hand or not. You can reuse value lands that sacrifice for an effect. A classic is using Wasteland to destroy opponents' lands. In older formats, you'd use it to destroy all of your opponent's lands so they can't cast spells, but in Commander, it would be more useful to use it to target unfair lands your opponents have, like a Field of the Dead. That's a card you definitely want to get off the table, and there are plenty more uber powerful lands you need to be able to interact with. But what makes Conduit of Worlds so special is that it can let you cast non-land permanent cards from your graveyard as well. It does require that it be the only spell you cast for your turn, but having that access to play important pieces from your graveyard is a huge boon. It can help you replay your combo piece if it gets destroyed, or it can just provide you card advantage if you didn't have anything relevant to play that turn anyway. Importantly, it doesn't give the card you cast from the graveyard any extra text that would exile it if it leaves play, or a finality counter or anything like that. You can cast a permanent from your graveyard, like let's say something ridiculous like a Mindslaver, sacrifice it, and then replay it from your graveyard again the next turn. It lets you loop the same card over and over every turn, even if it keeps getting destroyed. The versatility and inevitability it provides is excellent and shouldn't be overlooked. I see a lot of people play in landfall decks, graveyard decks, and decks that sacrifice lands like Thalia and the Gitrog monster, and decks that mill or discard lands like Borborygmus Enraged, and it makes a lot of sense and fits well in those decks. But I think it's worth a test in lots of other decks that aren't built around the lands theme. It enables a kind of playstyle similar to the old The Rock decks. It can even fit in something simple like a Yeva Nature's Herald deck. Any deck can play fetch lands and lands that sacrifice to benefit from it, and it can let you cast a spell from your graveyard on your turn while not interrupting your plan of casting creatures on other people's turns. This card has a lot of potential. Next, let's talk about River's Rebuke. For 4 and 2 blue, you get a sorcery that reads, return all non-land permanents target player controls to their owner's hand. This card is something that comes up when people look for budget versions of Cyclonic Rift. It does something similar, but worse, and the card costs less than $1. I think there are a lot of decks that I would be happy to play both in. There aren't a lot of good board wipes in blue, almost no good ones actually, but River's Rebuke is usually one of the first 3 I look at when building a deck. Now, just to be clear, River's Rebuke is nowhere near as strong as Cyclonic Rift is, just based on power level alone. You should always play that one first if you have access to it and don't have budget limitations or anything. But there are a couple fringe cases in which River's Rebuke can be used just as well or to even greater effect than a Cyclonic Rift. River's Rebuke can be used more effectively politically. Cyclonic Rift, when overloaded, will always blow all your opponent's permanents off the board, no questions asked. Your opponents will all see you as at fault and have an interest in punishing you for the play, by targeting or attacking you if they can. On the other hand, River's Rebuke allows you to target one player who is the archenemy at the time, and protect players that are in a worse position to grapple back. It can even set off a round of each player attacking the newly vulnerable player because they smell blood in the water before they can redeploy their board. River's Rebuke is a card that when used at an opportune time can make you friends, or break through clogged up board stalls, or even finish off a player by leaving them defenseless to an alpha strike. And it can even go in budget decks. It's a great card that I think should see a lot more play. It goes great in something like a Zevlor Elturel Exile, because Zevlor turns all your spells with a single target into spells that target all of your opponents. It can turn a River's Rebuke into a sorcery speed Cyclonic Rift. It's good in just regular old Spellslinger decks because it can give some colors that don't handle certain permanent types a way to get them off the board for a turn, like with Tauran Sky Summoner, or just be used as a sorcery speed way to clear out blockers for creature decks like Marchesa the Black Rose. Next up is a card that I don't really see played or talked about at all. It's Set's Tiger. For 2 and 2 white, you get a 3/3 with Flash. When it enters the battlefield, you gain protection from the color of your choice until end of turn. Now, this isn't a card that's going to blow anybody's socks off, but I think it's an interesting little gotcha card in white, a color with spotty counterspell type abilities. Let me explain. First off, you can use it sort of like a fog effect. You get protection from any one color, so any creatures attacking you of that color will have their combat damage prevented. It's a surprise blocker, so it can eat a smaller creature attacking you and prevent the damage from the rest. But what I think is so interesting about Set's Tiger is that it can counter a spell or ability that targets you. You will have protection from that color, which not only means you can't take damage from sources of that color, but you also can't be targeted or enchanted by effects of that color. If a player targets you with a Rakdos' Return, for example, you can cast a Tiger in response and effectively counter the spell. I think that's worth a second look. There may be an increase in decks that care about committing crimes with the prevalent new mechanic in Thunder Junction, and Set's Tiger can counter those crimes if they target you. Set's Tiger can counter a stack full of Blood Artist triggers after a board wipe. Not a lot of things can prevent that kind of interaction. It can keep you from getting blown out from a Settle the Wreckage type spell when you're on the attack. Anything that targets you can be countered. If an opponent stormed off and is trying to kill you with 50 copies of Tendrils of Agony, you can give yourself protection from all of those copies. Using Set's Tiger as a versatile fog or counterspell gives it a little bit of potential, and it's on an ETB effect, so you can do it over and over with blink effects like Ephemerate. One interaction that isn't particularly relevant and won't come up often, but I think is kind of funny, is if someone tries to kill you with a Painter Servant and Grindstone combo. Normally, Set's Tiger wouldn't protect you from colorless sources, as colorless isn't a choosable color, but the combo requires Painter Servant to make the Grindstone and everything else a color, which you can then choose to give yourself protection from. There are just a lot of little edge cases like this where you can use the Tiger as a gotcha to counter things you'd never expect. I see that a lot of people play Set's Tiger in cat creature type decks, which is fine. It works perfectly well in an Arabo Roar of the World deck, or one of the other legends that care about cats. But I think it also goes great in blink decks, or decks that can return it to hand over and over, like Niambi Esteemed Speaker, or a deck that just cares about playing at flash speed, like Ephara God of the Polis. No one is going to expect a Set's Tiger to ruin their plans. Lastly, let's talk about Rose Cutthroat Raider from the Fallout Commander decks. For 2 and 2 red, you get a 3/2 First Striker. It has a raid ability that says, at end of combat on your turn, if you attack this turn, create a junk token for each opponent you attacked. Then it has a triggered ability. Whenever you sack a junk, you get 1 red mana. This card is one of fleetingly few that provides red decks card draw on attacks. Granted, it is impulse draw, but it's in the form of artifact tokens that you can activate that turn or save for another turn. That flexibility is important. You can create up to 3 junk tokens per each of your turns if you attack all 3 of the other players. Rose is also an artifact, so it fits in a lot of red artifact decks. It'll trigger the typical Reckless Fireweaver and Crime Novelist abilities of the cards you would normally be playing in those decks anyway. But you don't have to play Rose in artifact decks only. In aggressive red, white, and black decks, or any combination of those colors, Rose can provide you with a lot of card advantage in colors that can struggle to keep the card draw flowing. Red, white, and black may have just a few each of creatures that can draw you 1 or more cards per turn while you're attacking, like Gix, Yawgmoth Praetor, or Firemane Commando. So adding another to the mix that has the potential to let you see 3 extra cards per turn cycle is great for red decks. And can we just talk about junk tokens very quickly? I think they're an amazing addition to the game. Red is the worst color when it comes to card draw in my opinion, and adding a new artifact token, which fits Red's color pie well by the way, that can help you impulse draw is an excellent design and very helpful for giving decks in struggling color combinations more options to compete. I really hope that junk tokens return and become a frequently printed mechanic that can join the other prevalent tokens, like clue tokens and treasure tokens. I'd really love to see an in-universe version of Rose and an in-universe inclusion of junk tokens and other Commander products. I hope it doesn't just stay a Fallout thing. Anyway, Rose fits great in the normal artifact decks like Duretti, Scrap Savant, like we talked about. The passive mana Rose produces when you sacrifice artifacts is strong, and I think the card would still be great without it, but it can really power up those red sack decks. I think Rose would fit great in something like a Saskia the Unyielding. That type of deck wants to be attacking every turn and doesn't want to have to take time off from putting pressure on opponents to ramp or draw cards. Rose can keep you aggressive while fulfilling those functions. It would also go great in something like Nelly Borka Impulsive Accuser. Nelly Borka also wants to attack, goad, and needs a steady stream of cards. Rose fits right in. Thank you for watching, everybody. What do you think about the cards we discussed today? Are these cards diamonds in the rough, or just more rough? Are there any cards you think are hidden gems? Let me know in the comments down below, and give the video a like and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. I will see you next time, and have a great rest of your day.